Collaboration is a hugely overused word. So as you said, I've worked 28 years in the advertising business, which I gave up about 3 years ago. Collaboration, or the word, is rife. Okay, it is consistently talked about, and actually in reality, at best, it's cooperation, is in terms of my experience. And what I think is quite kind of, compelling for me is, if I look back to maybe 5 or 10 years ago, doing this today would have not been possible. I did very, very well in the advertising business, but I went through a period of time from about, I would say, 15 years into it to about the last 5 years when I was crippled with anxiety and depression. And I'll explain why and how that's relevant to collaboration. But the point is a long time ago, I used to adore doing this. And when I started to suffer, I absolutely hated it. I mean, really, really hated it. I would have taken many different options, which I won't go into now because my children might watch this, than actually do it. But what I found is, since I started my business, and I'm talking about something I love, all of that energy and that passion's come back. So when we look at collaboration, I think it can be such an amazing thing, such an incredibly invigorating, brilliant thing for organizations and individuals. But with most things in life that can be brilliant, the converse can be really, really hideous. And when I go back to my personal story, very, very briefly, the reason I got into the place I got into, not the sole reason, but probably a significant amount, was quite simply that when you are feeling depressed or you are suffering from clinical depression, I spent 5 years in psychotherapy for it. We're not talking just I'm not feeling very well today, we're talking quite serious. And anxiety. Every time I was in a collaborative environment, because I didn't feel I could add much or I was worth that much, all of the alphas that you always see in these so-called collaborative teams just pushed me down. And that just made the whole cycle worse. So what I want to just kind of start with, I suppose, is the definition of collaboration is, certainly from a business point of view, is a working practice where individuals come together for a common purpose for business benefit. Okay? If we just stop for a second and just kind of rewind. The 3 main points there. Individuals. I mean, individuals really doesn't sound massively collaborative, does it, really? Common purpose, you kind of go, well, how does that work? Individuals, human beings, are probably the most competitive animal on the planet. We will do anything to succeed, often at someone else's expense. We have done amazing things, but we're also solely responsible for the car crash of the environment at the moment. So really, human beings aren't that brilliant at these things. You look at the UK government or the Houses of Commons at the moment, collaboration, I mean, seriously. And you look at these things and you start to go, well, how do these individuals actually come together for common purpose? Because the two things are contradictory. Business benefit is a really difficult one. I've, as I said, worked for 30 years. I know it's probably hard to believe, but I did. For 30 years, and every business I've ever worked in, they have different key performance indicators. Some are after margin, some are after pure profit, some are after revenue. And actually, the whole thing of trying to get a load of people together to agree, I think, is a huge challenge. I believe there are 3 key drivers to success or not in collaboration. And number one is ego, okay? And I think ego, hence the name of my talk, leave ego at the door, is the number one driver. Second is balance, and that's balance within the team, balance within the individuals within the team, and a balanced view on what is trying to be achieved. And the third is mindset. Now, within mindset, mental health becomes a part of that. But I want to start with ego. If you imagine, all human beings have ego, okay? But I can't think of a collaborative environment I've ever sat in where there is not someone trying to drive their own agenda, or 2 people, or 3, or all of them. And I started to I started to kind of unpack why that might be. And I think balance is a key measure here. If you have people who are super alpha and have massive egos and are trying to drive their own agenda, you clearly don't have balance within the group. Because what you'll find is someone who may just be a bit quieter naturally, someone who might be suffering from, a mental health condition, or just someone who's just not as loud is going to get shouted down. And funnily enough, the one who shouts the most gets what they want. So that is not collaboration. So balance, I think, is really important. And mindset. I mean, the amount of times that I, in my career, of saying, you, and you will collaborate. Well, it doesn't quite work like that because you don't, because you instantly become defensive. So I believe ego, balance, and mindset are the three key drivers. What I think is also interesting is when you start to have a look at what are the key characteristics of someone who's very good at collaborating or who has the potential, there are 6 things. One is communication, the actual ability to be able to communicate, and there's a clue in communication. There's an old saying of 2 ears, 1 mouth. Yeah, a lot of people have about 5 mouths and no ears, you'll find. That's number 1. Authenticity is very, very important as well. Now, to be authentic, you have to have no ego. There is no way, if you look at anyone who's in a collaborative environment, who's being made to work together, whether that's a big firm of individuals by departments or individual companies that are separate or individual companies in a holding company, inevitably people put on a show. So they're not necessarily authentic. You then look at things like compromise. Big egos, haven't found many of those over the years who are good at compromising. Tolerance is another thing. Tolerance, to actually be tolerant in the fact that different people are different. Some people like to shout and get their point across and bang a table. Some people are very quiet. What you'll always find, in my experience, is the people who are quiet often have the best thing to say. And the people who sit there for 2 or 3 hours whilst this meeting goes on and then come out with some bit of genius at the end, it's not always the one who's doing this, who's got much to say. Being a team player is absolutely key, and being reliable. Again, I don't think any 6 of those characteristics are things that you would go, you know what, Joe Smith at work or whoever it is, who is super alpha, has those characteristics. I don't think I think it's highly unlikely that you'd say that. So I want to just have a look at some examples from my life and from other experiences that I've kind of had, and a lot of talking to people about this ever since I was going to do this talk. A good example is back in the advertising world, but also in any world, where you have this kind of scene, you can imagine. So you've got a CEO of a big supplier company, a holding company, or a big group of companies, together with the CEO of a customer or a client. They're in a very fine restaurant, and over a bottle of Chateau Lafite 55, no idea if that's any good, but sounds quite good. They decide they're going to do a deal, all right? And so that piece of business goes to that holding company. And that's fantastic, because the CEO of the supplier company goes, brilliant, I've got the, whatever it is, 2-3 million quid. I don't really care what happens now, I've got that. The client thinks, I've got exactly what I want, I've got best in class. What they've actually got is a load of factions who are then going to fight. Because what happens, and I have personal experience of this, is that deal's done. It then filters down into the companies within the holding company, or the departments, or whatever the structure is. And then people fight, because we're human beings and we're competitive. So you're fighting for budget, you're fighting for strategic control, you're fighting for whatever it happens to be. And what does human nature do when you're in a fight? You put your best people in the room, don't you? So in my scenario, that was suddenly you'd have MD, CEO level people of individual companies within a holding company, all sitting in a room fighting for their own slice of the pie. And fundamentally, it doesn't work, because you've got those people instantly on the back foot. That is not collaboration in any shape or form. Conversely, what you find is if you look at a startup business, and that can be across any category, startup businesses are, on the face of it, they look amazing at collaboration. But actually, are they? Because when you're a startup, you've left your lovely six-figure salary job, you've got together with a couple of mates, and you've all got this massive drive, we're going to do it ourselves, we're going to be our own bosses and all these sorts of things. That's all lovely. I did it myself 3 years ago. But what's fascinating is you have to collaborate. At that point, you've waved bye-bye to all the big research departments and all the back office stuff that you had, and you're having to collaborate. What tends to happen is you get to about 50 to 100 people, and all of a sudden, you stop collaborating quite so much. All of a sudden, you get a bit paranoid about your IP that you've developed or the way you do things. And all of a sudden, you don't need that help anymore. And at that point, you often find these people who were brilliant collaborators suddenly become uber protective and aren't interested anymore. I think that's a really, really interesting area. One of the things I've always seen, and I suspect most of you will have seen this as well, in business and sport, the two things are very, very similar. It's very, very difficult. Lots of learnings within sport are obviously transferable to business. Probably more that way than the other way, to be honest. Now, I'll be slightly UK focused here, but if we take football or soccer as an example, probably one of the best known brands in the world would be Manchester United. If you I'll probably upset a few people here, but it's a fact. I don't support them. But what you find is, if you look back at the late 90s, there was a Manchester United side who were practically invincible. They won everything. Okay? They were exceptionally brilliant. What's really interesting at that time, when you start to break that down, is outside of David Beckham and a few others, anyone who's really into football, Ryan Giggs, Paul Scholes, people like that, they really weren't this incredible team from an individual point of view. They had a few superstars, but not many. And what was really interesting is you look at the strike force, i.e. their strikers, the people scoring the goals and winning those games, quite frankly, saying average is unfair, but they certainly wouldn't have walked into a Real Madrid side or a Barcelona side or indeed any of those top sides in the Premiership today. So why were they invincible? And it was really because, in pure collaboration, they were exceptional. They had a brilliant manager in Sir Alex Ferguson who ensured everyone was drilled, everyone knew what their role was, and nobody was brave enough to step out of line. They worked together tirelessly, they trained together all the time, and they almost knew exactly what the individual was going to do. That is why they were just exceptional. And that was a brilliant example of collaborating effectively together. Conversely, you look at some teams, and people like Chelsea would be a good example. Someone super rich comes in, buys them, pumps a whole load of cash in there, and they go out and they buy the best players in every single position. And what happens? You've got this massive ego clash, it's completely imbalanced, and people are just fighting against each other. And there's probably only one manager in the world that could have handled that, and that was Alex Ferguson, probably. So all of a sudden you look at that and you see this kind of conflict. I just want to kind of refer to something that for me is very, very important for me, sport-wise, and that was rowing. I rowed to a reasonably high level from about 13 up till 30 until my back finally gave up on me. And there was an incredible race that I saw, which was Henley, I think it was 1999. And some of you would have heard of Sir Steve Redgrave, Olympic gold medalist times 5, the most decorated Olympian in any endurance sport. And he was coming towards the end of his career, but he was in a four with some much younger guys, Matthew Pinsent, James Cracknell, and Tim Foster. These guys were bigger, stronger, faster than anyone. In the previous 3 or 4 world championships, everyone you could see was racing for silver. And they were just exceptional, this team. They were all about 6'5", 16 stone of muscle. They were incredible specimens. And in the rowing world, a big good 'un will often beat a small good 'un is the saying. They came up against the Danish lightweight 4, who were exceptional. But they were giving away about 5 or 6 inches in height and about 5 stone in weight. In theory, they should have been nowhere near them. But the pressure, all that pressure, ego, expectation was on the Redgrave 4, who were just massive and powerful and strong. The Danes, the story doesn't work perfectly because the Danes didn't win, but they lost by about that much, okay? And it was absolutely gobsmacking to see a 4 with such power and aura about them being pushed to that level by these guys who, quite frankly, shouldn't have been able to do it. But when you watched them, they were moving the boat so efficiently, working as one, you could almost not see any difference between any 4 of them. So I think that's a really good example of, of kind of how coming together and that whole, greater than the sum of the parts is a really, really, really truism there. So what I really want people to take away from today is when most businesses or people collaborate, they think about if there are lots of different companies coming together or departments that are trying to grab budget from each other, they always tend to put their superstar in. Yeah, they always go, right, you know what, I need the best team I can possibly get. And the best team isn't necessarily the best collaborative team. So if you go back to communication, authenticity, compromise, tolerance, team player, and reliability, I think you'd probably all agree that actually that doesn't necessarily mean the best, most talented, top talent person within the company. Collaborating is about the right mindset and really understanding that actually it's not about your top talent, it's about people who will want to work together. Every team in the world needs people who do stuff, who get things done. So I would just love people to take away from this, think about who has the ability to actually collaborate rather than just stick super talent in, because it's not always the case. Thank you.